We begin with something very strange, the medieval mindset that still quietly runs our lives. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what's shared here. And feel free to say where you're joining from. Peekaboo, it's always fascinating to see who's listening around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into this slightly ridiculous journey together. You probably think the standard workday came from the Industrial Revolution, crafted by clever men in waistcoats, calculating the perfect number of hours before workers dropped dead. But no, it came from monks. In the Middle Ages, monks were the only people organized enough to mark time and annoying enough to make everyone else follow along. Their lives ran on a sacred, endless loop of bells, morning bells, midday bells, bells for prayer, bells for eating, bells for regretting you ever took vows. It was less a spiritual path and more a divine alarm system with extra guilt. The day was divided into what they called canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and complinage. Sounds less like prayer times and more like rejected spells from a fantasy novel. At each interval, monks would stop whatever they were doing to chant, kneel, or stare blankly into eternity. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about obedience. You weren't supposed to think, you were supposed to synchronize with God, the abbey, and whoever was manning the bell tower. And yes, there was always that one monk who rang it 2 minutes early just to watch the world burn. Over the centuries, the world outside caught the contagion. Towns scheduled markets by church bells. Guilds used them to mark work hours. Eventually, factories copied the whole system, minus the praying, plus screaming managers. When industrialization arrived, someone basically said, let's take the monastic routine, remove the faith, and add paperwork, and thus the modern workday was born. The monks at least got silence, wine, and robes that doubled as pajamas. You get fluorescent lights and Slack notifications. Even the lunch break has roots in monastic timekeeping, the sext hour, when monks paused to pray and maybe sneak a bite before returning to their divine spreadsheets. So, the next time your alarm drags you from sleep toward another day of labor in exchange for rent and mild back pain, remember, you're not modern, you're medieval, just without the chanting or the forgiveness. The 9-to-5 didn't evolve. It escaped the monastery, put on a suit, and learned to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone muttered, bless you, congratulations, you've just taken part in one of humanity's oldest and dumbest reflexes. It's not politeness, it's medieval panic that never got the memo about germ theory. Back in the 6th century, when plague swept Europe, sneezing wasn't a mild inconvenience, it was a death omen. 1 sneeze meant infection. 2 meant your neighbors were already dividing your belongings. The logic: when you sneezed, your soul tried to escape through your nose. The devil, always lurking nearby, might snatch it midair. So Pope Gregory the Great, in 590 CE, decreed that every sneeze needed divine backup. He ordered the faithful to respond with "God bless you," turning basic biology into a team sport. Each "bless you" was an emergency prayer, a miniature exorcism for someone with seasonal allergies. The phrase spread faster than the plague itself. Soon, entire villages were shouting it in unison every time someone inhaled pollen. Imagine the soundscape: church bells, roosters, and 40 voices yelling, "God bless you." At once, it worked not medically, but socially. Saying it proved you weren't the kind of monster who'd let a neighbor die unblessed. Refusing was practically witchcraft. The superstition stuck. Even after centuries of science, hygiene, and vaccines, we still bless sneezers as if it's 1348. No one believes souls are escaping anymore, but we still panic at nasal explosions. Meanwhile, the only thing truly escaping during a sneeze is 100,000 droplets of bacteria at 100 miles per hour directly into someone's face. And no one blesses you for that. So next time you instinctively say, "Bless you," know this: you're reenacting a medieval ritual invented to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not being polite, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old mass delusion. And somehow, it's still good manners. The next time you twirl spaghetti or politely stab a piece of chicken, remember, in medieval Europe, that simple act would have gotten you labeled a heretic. Yes, the fork, that harmless utensil in your drawer, was once considered a tool of Satan. It arrived in Western Europe around the 11th century, brought by wealthy Byzantine nobles who used small golden versions to eat dainty bites without dirtying their hands. Logical, right? Wrong. The church immediately had a meltdown. Clergymen declared forks an insult to God, who had already provided the perfect eating tools, fingers. Preferring metal over flesh apparently bordered on blasphemy. One famous case involved a Byzantine princess who married into Venetian royalty and brought her gold forks. Local priests lost their minds. When she later died of plague, the clergy smugly declared it divine punishment for using a shiny pronged stick instead of God-given digits. For centuries, Europeans ate with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even Renaissance nobles hesitated. Knives and spoons were acceptable. One stabbed, one scooped. Both felt biblical enough, but the fork had vibes. Ironically, people kept dying of foodborne illness because, shockingly, dirty fingers aren't hygienic. But no amount of dysentery could outweigh the church's logic. God made hands, ergo, use them. Only in the 17th century did Italy's fashionable elite declare forks elegant, and the rest of Europe finally caved. The English, of course, joined last, calling forks effeminate, until someone important used one in public. So next time you sit at a table and twirl your pasta, know this: you're performing an act once deemed morally questionable. The medieval church fought sanitation, elegance, and table decorum, and lost. In a poetic way, every dinner with cutlery is a tiny victory for common sense over organized superstition, or, as priests would have called it, temptation served in silver. If you think bachelor parties today are chaotic, imagine them with swords. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love or shared streaming accounts. It was a financial transaction. But even then, men couldn't resist one last night of poor decisions before signing their lives away. Thus was born the medieval stag night, the original bachelor party. Knights would gather in taverns or manors, drink ale until their helmets didn't fit, gamble away their horses, and loudly swear eternal loyalty to freedom, usually lasting about 8 hours. These celebrations were meant to honor the groom's transition into responsibility. In practice, They were excuses to see how much mead a man could consume before falling into a moat. The stag symbolized vitality and wildness, medieval code for drunken regret. Guests toasted the groom's bravery while quietly betting how long he'd survive domestic life. Someone would inevitably challenge another to a duel, and at least one man would mistake the bride's cousin for a barmaid. Parties, calling them feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was accurate. Priests warned that drunkenness before marriage led to damnation. Knights, naturally, took this as a challenge. Over time, the tradition trickled down to townsfolk, who swapped castles for taverns and armor for leather shoes, but the spirit remained. Eat, drink, and behave terribly, because tomorrow you're legally obligated not to. Even the morning after rituals were familiar. Hangovers, awkward silences, promises never to speak of what happened. The only real difference: no smartphones to record the evidence. So when you see a modern groom stumbling out of a bar wearing a plastic crown and regret, you're witnessing history. It's the same tradition, just without swords, plague, or Sir Geoffrey trying to juggle flaming torches while yelling about love. Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They just downgraded from chainmail to matching t-shirts. And somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone dies today, we instinctively dress in black. It feels respectful, somber, even timeless. But the truth is, it's just a medieval fashion trend that got wildly out of hand. The color of mourning used to depend on geography. Romans wore white to funerals, clean, symbolic, and excellent for reflecting heat under the Italian sun. But medieval Europe looked at that and said, no, let's make grief depressing and stylish. Black dye was expensive, so only the wealthy could afford to look properly devastated. Peasants wore whatever was clean, which, statistically, was nothing. Nobles, however, turned mourning into theater. Draped in black wool and veils, they wailed dramatically through the streets, because grief, like everything else, had to be performative. The church loved it. Black symbolized humility before God damned, conveniently made the clergy's wardrobe look pious instead of lazy. Over time, black mourning spread to all classes, because nothing says repentance like fabric that absorbs both heat and despair. By the 14th century, black funerals were the ultimate power move. Kings died in black. Widows lived in black. Entire courts spent years in coordinated sadness. Queen Victoria later revived the custom by wearing black for 40 years, a record-breaking emotional hostage situation. Eventually, the color lost its religious meaning, but stuck anyway. Now we show up to funerals dressed like accountants who misfiled eternity because the Middle Ages decided grief. So next time you attend a funeral in black, remember, you're not channeling timeless reverence. You're following a 1,000-year-old fashion rule invented by rich people trying to look holy. And as with all fashion, it was never really about the dead. It was about proving you cared more stylishly than everyone else. Ah, the handshake, that sacred gesture of civility, professionalism, and bacterial exchange. It seems polite, even human, but its origins are, like most medieval customs, deeply suspicious. In the Middle Ages, people didn't shake hands to say hello. They did it to say, please don't murder me. Medieval Europe was paranoid. Everyone carried weapons. Everyone owed someone a debt. And everyone's cousin was plotting a coup. So when two men met, they'd extend their right hands to prove they weren't holding a dagger. The shaking part came later. Little jiggle to ensure no knife was hidden up the sleeve. It was less a greeting, more a mutual weapons inspection. Knights, merchants, even kings used it though, usually with a sword hand trembling from the effort of pretending to trust someone. Left-handed people, of course, were deemed untrustworthy simply because their weapon hand was on the wrong side. Medieval logic, flawless as always. By the 16th century, it evolved into a formal greeting among gentlemen, replacing bows and awkward silence. It became a sign of equality. We are both free men, capable of stabbing each other, but choosing not to. Centuries later, businessmen turned this survival tactic into a networking ritual. The same gesture once used to check for hidden blades now seals multi-million-dollar deals, which, let's be honest, are just modern jewels, slower with lawyers. Even a global health crisis couldn't kill it. Doctors warned us to stop shaking hands, and humanity collectively said, no, we'd rather risk plague than seem rude. A very medieval mindset, really. So, the next time someone grips your hand too tightly at a meeting, remember what they're really saying. I come in. Peace for now. The handshake isn't a symbol of trust. It's a fossil from an age when trust could get you stabbed. And given how business still works, maybe it hasn't changed that much after all. If you've ever been told to chew with your mouth closed, not talk while eating, or stop licking the knife, congratulations. You're practicing ancient survival techniques invented by medieval people tired of dying from dinner. Table manners didn't start for elegance. They started because medieval dining was horrifying. Picture a long wooden table covered in greasy trenchers, stale bread bowls serving as plates with everyone sharing the same knife, same bowl, same fingers. You didn't have personal utensils, you had hope. No napkins, either. The standard was to wipe your hands on the nearest dog or neighbor. Monks complained about guests wiping grease on sacred scripture. And yes, there were rules against spitting on the table, which implies someone had to invent that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust evolved into etiquette. Manuals, like the Book of the Civilized Man, taught you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose in the tablecloth. These were actual instructions, meaning they weren't obvious at the time. The upper class turned hygiene into hierarchy. Peasants ate with hands. Nobles used manners to prove superiority, a social fencing match with spoons instead of swords. Eventually, manners became moral. The church decided proper table behavior reflected a clean soul because nothing says holiness like daintily slurping soup while believing in witchcraft. By the Renaissance, dining shifted from survival to performance. Banquets were less about eating and more about proving you weren't a barbarian. It was Instagram cultured, but with trenchers. And yet those same rules are still with us. Don't burp, don't pick, don't shout. You're not doing them to be polite. You're doing them because, in another timeline, not doing them could have given you dysentery. You probably think the weekend was a modern invention, a triumph of labor. Unions or enlightened bosses who valued rest. Nope. It was invented by medieval peasants who wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and occasionally remember what sunlight looked like. In the Middle Ages, there was no weekend. You worked until your body broke, then worked slightly more. But the church, in its infinite mercy, decided people should rest not for health, but to attend Mass and avoid sinning unsupervised. The church calendar overflowed with feast days, sometimes 100 per year, honoring obscure saints, the Virgin Mary, and events that suspiciously resembled excuses for parties. Each meant a day off, free food, and the legal right to drink. Before noon, nobles complained peasants had too many holidays. One medieval bishop grumbled they work one day and rest 3, possibly the first recorded case of a manager complaining about productivity. Later, the Reformation trimmed the calendar, canceling 2 fun saint days. The Puritans, horrified by leisure, pushed for 1 mandatory rest day, Sunday, the Lord's Day, which slowly became the modern lazy day. Then came industrialization. Factory owners noticed overworked laborers kept breaking things, including themselves, so they reluctantly reintroduced rest. Saturday afternoons were added when someone realized less exhausted workers made fewer mistakes, like falling into machinery. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend was official. 1 day for God, 1 for hangovers. So the next time you collapse into bed on a Saturday night, remember, you're enjoying a tradition born from medieval religion, refined by Protestant guilt and perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Monday again. The weekend wasn't given out of kindness. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and scheduling. And somehow, we're still thanking God for it. When you slide on a wedding ring today, you're not just declaring eternal love, you're reenacting a medieval property exchange. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic transaction with decorative vows. Love came after the paper were usually followed by regret and joint land management. The ring wasn't a symbol of devotion. It was a receipt. The idea traces back to ancient Egypt, where circles symbolized eternity. Romans adopted it, with men giving rings to women as proof of ownership. By medieval Europe, the church saw PR gold, a symbol of faithfulness that doubled as a legal shackle. The ring went on the 4th finger of the left hand because people believed the vena amoris, the vein of love, ran straight to the heart. This was nonsense. Medieval science also thought headaches came from demons and that leeches had medical degrees. But the myth stuck mostly because it sounded poetic enough to justify the cost of gold. Weddings themselves were barely religious until the church got involved. Before that, common law sufficed. Say I do before witnesses, shake hands, and boom, you're married. The church saw a business opportunity. Soon, only clergy-blessed unions were valid, and rings became mandatory props. And don't be fooled. Early rings were rarely worn by men. For centuries, the ring was a one-way symbol, woman's visible mark of possession, not partnership. Husbands didn't start wearing them until the 20th century, when World War II soldiers used them to remember wives or signal they were taken, even overseas. Now the wedding ring is everywhere, a tiny metal halo symbolizing love, trust, and eternity, until someone forgets it on the bathroom sink. So when you glance at that band of gold, remember what it really means. Not eternal romance, not divine blessing. It's a medieval merger agreement that survived every cultural collapse since the Crusades. You're not wearing a symbol of love. You're wearing a 900-year-old contract with better branding. In the Middle Ages, the average person's home made a modern studio apartment look like Versailles. Walls, optional. Doors, overrated. Privacy, a myth. Most lived in single rooms, shared with family, animals, and whatever spirits haunted the rafters. The medieval idea of personal space was please stop stepping on the chicken. Then came fabric, the miraculous technology that could hide things without building walls. Curtains started as practical objects, heavy drapes to block drafts, flies, and nosy neighbors, but soon they became social statements. Nobles hung thick, embroidered curtains around beds not just for warmth, but for dignity. These bed hangings were like portable bedrooms, creating the illusion of privacy in halls filled with servants, snoring relatives, and the occasional bard. If you were wealthy enough, your bed had curtains grand enough to double as stage sets. Some even had inner curtains, privacy from your own spouse. Guests often slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed. So if you wanted to change clothes, pray, or cry dramatically, curtains were your only defense. Peasants caught on, using rags to partition their homes, hanging a blanket between you and the pigsty suddenly felt luxurious. Curtains became the medieval equivalent of noise-canceling headphones, mostly symbolic, mildly effective. Over time, the concept spread. Privacy became a social aspiration. By the Renaissance, curtains were everywhere, on beds, walls, windows, and egos. The wealthier you were, the thicker your drapes. Centuries later, we still do it. We draw curtains at night as if hiding from the Inquisition, not the neighbor's porch light. We buy blackout, thermal, and privacy shears-proof. We've upgraded the fabric, but not the paranoia. So next time you close your curtains before bed, remember, you're reenacting a medieval ritual to shield yourself from judgment, gossip, and cold air. The only real difference. Your neighbors probably aren't watching. Probably, when you hear God Save the King, you likely think of national pride. When you hear God Save the King, you likely think of national pride, dignified anthem sung by loyal citizens. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't about patriotism at all. It was an exorcism. The phrase began as a protective prayer, spiritual insurance policy for monarchs who had the life expectancy of a ham sandwich at a jousting tournament. Medieval people believed kings were God-chosen, but also that Satan had terrible boundary issues. Every rebellion, plague, or bad harvest was blamed on demonic interference. So God Save the King wasn't a cheer. It was crisis management. Whenever a ruler fell ill or someone sneezed near the throne, the church organized public prayers to ward off evil. Crowds would chant the phrase like a magic spell because, in their minds, it was. The logic. If enough peasants yelled loudly enough, God might hear over the screams of the dying. It worked exactly as well as you'd expect. Kings still died mostly from poison, war, or other kings, but people kept chanting because superstition is the one political tradition humanity never reforms. By the 16th century, the phrase became ceremonial, used in church services, royal processions, and desperate attempts to look loyal. Saying it proved you weren't plotting treason, or at least not that day. In an era when bad-mouthing the crown meant execution, God Save the King was less about faith and more about self-preservation. The song version came much later. In the 18th century, when England turned this medieval emergency chant into a national anthem, what began as "Please don't let the devil kill our monarch" became "Please don't let France do it instead." And here we are. centuries later, still singing it with hands on hearts, pretending it's about unity, when historically, it was just crowdsourced holy water. So the next time you hear a stadium belting "God Save the King," remember, you're witnessing a medieval ghost ritual. Only now, it's televised. The idea of a day of rest sounds humane, maybe even progressive. But the medieval church didn't invent it to protect your well-being. They invented it to make sure you didn't skip Mass. In early medieval Europe, the church ran everything: your calendar, your conscience, and if necessary, your afterlife. So they declared Sunday sacred, not because peasants needed a break, but because priests needed an audience. If you were caught working on Sunday, you weren't breaking labor law, you were offending God. This wasn't an HR infraction. It was eternal damnation. Imagine confessing, "Forgive me, Father, for I weeded my garden during Vespers." The rule was clear: no plowing, weaving, blacksmithing, or selling unless the church was selling indulgences. That was miraculously fine. Sermons warned that ignoring the Lord's Day risked divine punishment. And because medieval Europe adored horror stories, legends abounded. A man who baked bread on Sunday watched his dough turn to snakes. A farmer who sharpened his scythe on the Sabbath dropped dead. The moral: God had opinions on your hobbies. Enforcement was inconsistent, of course. Lords and nobles worked when they pleased because divine law, like modern policy, rarely applied to management. Peasants, meanwhile, were threatened with hell for trying to survive. When industry arrived, people rediscovered Sunday rest and rebranded it as family time. Employers called it moral. Workers called it barely enough. And despite 1,000 years of progress, the logic stayed medieval. You rest not because you deserve to, but because someone holier, richer, or louder said so. Today, most spend Sundays resting by doing unpaid labor laundry, errands, worrying about tomorrow. It's not quite holy, but it's traditional. So next time you feel guilty checking messages on a Sunday, relax. You're not defying God. You're honoring the medieval legacy of working when you're technically not supposed to. And if your boss emails you about it, tell them your dough just turned into snakes. When someone calls you sir or ma'am, it feels polite, respectful, even. But in the Middle Ages, those words didn't mean "I respect you." They meant "I recognize you could legally have me executed." Titles of address were the linguistic armor of feudal Europe. Society was a human pyramid, kings on top, peasants at the bottom, everyone else crushed in between. Calling someone sir, short for sire, from the old French seigneur, was how you acknowledged they owned your land, your livelihood, and possibly your spine. It wasn't optional. If you met a noble and forgot to bow, or you weren't born into fame. You were born into dust and horse sweat. The stables were your cradle. The sound of hooves, your lullaby. In the Roman world, charioteers didn't come from noble bloodlines. They came from chains. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or poor freedmen with more scars than coins. But that didn't matter, because in the circus, even a slave could become a god if he survived long enough to cross the finish line. From the moment you could walk, you learned to run alongside the horses. They were your only teachers, impatient, powerful, and merciless. The trainers barked orders, wielded whips, and told you the truth every boy dreaded to hear. The sand will drink your blood before the crowd ever remembers your name. But you didn't listen. You had a hunger, sharper than fear. Every morning began before dawn. You shoveled dung, brushed manes, and carried buckets until your arms trembled. And when the trainers weren't looking, you'd sneak onto the empty track, feeling the silence of the circus as if it were watching you. You'd imagine the stands filled with thousands Romans, cheering, jeering, wagering everything they owned on your death or your victory. It wasn't faith that kept you going. It was pride. Pride and the dream that for a few blazing minutes all of Rome would see you. The Circus Maximus was the beating heart of the empire, more powerful than any temple, louder than any Senate debate. 200,000 spectators, their voices thundering through marble seats. Men screamed, women fainted, and fortunes were won or lost in the time it took to complete 7 laps. No other stage offered such madness or such glory at night. You'd lie awake in the stables, staring at oil lamps flickering against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, noblemen slept in villas, but here, among the smell of straw and sweat, heroes were made. You didn't know if you'd die beneath the hooves or rise above them. You only knew one thing. One day they'd chant your name not as a slave, not as a servant, but as the master of the circus, the charioteer who tamed the storm. The stables were your world, hot, noisy, and always one mistake away from death. You served the factions, the racing teams of Rome, as fierce as a legion. There were the blues and greens, the reds and whites, 4 colors that divided the empire more passionately than politics or war. Every Roman had a side, from slaves in taverns to senators in togas. The circus wasn't just entertainment, it was religion, and you were about to be its priest. You began as a stable boy, a shadow among giants. You brushed horses until your hands blistered, fed them barley mixed with wine, and learned to read their moods the way a soldier reads an enemy. These weren't ordinary beasts. They were athletes, warriors in harness, Spanish stallions, Nubian mares, Cappadocian chargers, creatures so expensive that emperors fought over them. They were temperamental, proud, and faster than justice to earn your place in the chariot. You had to prove you could control them, not with force, but with trust. You slept beside them, whispered to them in the dark, and sometimes cried when one died, not just for the loss, but because your chance of glory died with it. The factions didn't care about your past. They cared about speed, instinct, and whether you could survive. Turn 1, the deadliest curve in Rome, where half the crashes happened before the second lap even began. And yet, despite the danger, men begged for the reins, because in that chariot you weren't property. You were power itself. The crowd didn't care if you were Greek, Gallic, or born in a dungeon. If you won, you were golden. Statues were raised, poems sung, and mistresses offered. Champions earned more in a season than senators did in a decade. Some even bought their freedom only to keep racing, because life outside the track felt like slow death. But glory was fickle. One moment you were carried on shoulders through the streets. The next, your body was dragged off the sand by slaves with hooks. No funeral, no stone, just a name scratched into a betting ledger, then forgotten. And still, boys lined up at dawn, hoping to take your place. Because, in Rome, there were 2 kinds of men, those who watched the race and those who ran it. You chose to run. Now, shifting back to Renaissance Rome, not as a historical moment, but as a living paradox. Rome was meant to be the beating heart of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims wept, and divine light bathed every corner. But peel back the gilded facade of marble and fresco, and you'd find something entirely different, a place where desire ruled as powerfully as faith. The same bells that called the faithful to Mass also tolled over a city drunk on its own vices. Pilgrims arrived seeking salvation, yet the streets reeked of perfume and wine. Taverns around Piazza Navona overflowed with priests who had clearly forgotten their vows of chastity and possibly sobriety. Noblemen strutted in velvet doublets, while courtesans leaned from balconies, laughing as church bells rang. Even confessionment, to cleanse the soul, became an erotic ritual, whispered behind latticed screens. Everywhere you looked, temptation was sponsored by the very institutions meant to suppress it. Monks dabbled in alchemy and spent more time brewing aphrodisiacal potions than copying scripture. Nuns exchanged love letters hidden in the pages of psalters. Now, shifting back to Renaissance, Rome not as a historical moment, but as a living paradox. Rome was meant to be the beating heart of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims wept, and divine light bathed every corner. But peel back the gilded facade of marble and fresco, and you'd find something entirely different, a place where desire ruled as powerfully as faith. The same bells that called the faithful to Mass also tolled over a city drunk on its own vices. Pilgrims arrived seeking salvation, yet the streets reeked of perfume and wine. Taverns around Piazza Navona overflowed with priests who had clearly forgotten their vows of chastity and, possibly, sobriety. Noblemen strutted in velvet doublets while courtesans leaned from balconies, laughing as church bells rang. Even confessionment, to cleanse the soul, became an erotic ritual, whispered behind latticed screens. Everywhere you looked, temptation was sponsored by the very institutions meant to suppress it. Monks dabbled in alchemy and spent more time brewing aphrodisiacal potions than copying scripture. Nuns exchanged love letters hidden in the pages of psalters. Bishops hosted banquets that would make pagan emperors blush. Roasted peacock, dancing girls, wine that never stopped flowing. At the center stood the Vatican, fortress of morality, or so it claimed. The papal palace wore virtue by day, but at night its corridors flickered with candlelight and laughter. Servants swore they saw mistresses slip through secret doors. Rumors spread of cardinals fathering more children than they could count. Rome, the city of saints, had turned itself into a Renaissance version of Las Vegas. If Las Vegas charged indulgences and quoted scripture while doing it, yet no one seemed truly scandalized. Hypocrisy had become an art form. A priest might preach against lust in the morning, visit his mistress in the afternoon, and commission a painting of the Virgin Mary that suspiciously resembled her by evening. Holiness was worn like jewelry, sparkling in the light, tarnished in the dark. The Pope wasn't just God's representative on earth, he was often the richest, most powerful man in Italy, and sometimes the most corrupt. Nowhere was this clearer than in the reigns of the so-called papal playboys, men who mixed sacred duty with personal pleasure as easily as wine with water. Take Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, the man whose name became synonymous with sin wrapped in silk. He fathered at least 8 children, officially. Unofficially, Rome lost count. His mistress, the beautiful Venazia de Cane, lived openly in a palazzo near the Vatican, while his other lover, Julia Farnese, was called the Pope's concubine by half of Europe. While he preached virtue, his son Cesare carved a trail of blood across Italy, and his daughter Lucretia was whispered to poison her lovers at banquets. The Borgias didn't hide their vices. They flaunted them in velvet robes embroidered with the family crest. But Alexander wasn't alone. Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, spent more time in armor than vestments, leading armies instead of prayers. He swore like a soldier and commissioned art like a king. Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were ironically funded by a pontiff who had fathered at least one illegitimate daughter. Pope Leo X, of the Medici family, treated the papacy like a Florentine bank account, throwing parties so lavish even Roman nobles blushed. For these men, indulgences weren't just doctrine, they were a lifestyle. Their banquets mixed cardinals, courtesans, poets, and painters, all swimming in gold and gossip. The Vatican treasury was drained not by crusades, but by carnival masks and mistresses, and yet the faithful kept donating, believing the Pope to be the moral anchor of the world. Rome's streets knew better. When a new pope was elected, the people didn't ask about his holiness, they bet on his lovers. The church had become a theater of sin dressed in silk and incense. Behind every holy decree lay a heartbeat, lusty, ambitious, and entirely human. If the popes were the kings of sin, then the courtesans of Rome were its queens. Not the Baccali kind, but the glittering elita courtisan once, or honest courtesans. Honest, of course, in the same way a wolf is honest about wanting sheep. These women could quote scripture in one breath and recite Ovid in the next, wearing gowns that could bankrupt a cardinal and jewelry that probably already had. Among them was Imperia Cognati, known simply as La Divina Imperia. Her name struck awe and fear in noblemen. She entertained cardinals, artists, and ambassadors in salons perfumed with incense and scandal. She wasn't just a beauty, she was an intellectual, a woman who could dismantle a bishop's argument about virtue while sipping Venetian wine. When she died, the city mourned her as if she were royalty. Even the clergy sent flowers, pretending it was out of Christian charity rather than fond memory. Then came Tullia d'Aragona, poet, philosopher, and rumored lover of half the Vatican secretaries. She wrote essays defending women's right to pleasure, something that made priests choke on their communion wafers. Her home became a gathering place for artists and thinkers, where discussions about theology always circled back to lust. These women navigated Roman society like seasoned diplomats. In a city ruled by men who preached purity but practiced indulgence, courtesans became the most cunning players. They knew every secret, every affair, every whispered promise made in candlelit confessionals. A well-placed word from a courtesan could ruin a career or ignite a PayPal feud. They weren't just tolerated, they were necessary. When diplomacy failed, Rome sent not soldiers, but smiles. Noble women, meanwhile, cultivated their own brand of scandal, far more discreet, but no less daring. They lived in marble palaces gilded with virtue, yet their hearts and letters burned with passion. Marriage was a political contract, not a romantic union. So when a duchess found herself chained to a dull husband, twice her age. The natural solution was a confessor, one who listened very carefully and, on occasion, stayed the night. Among them was Vittoria Colonna, celebrated poet and widow. Her piety made her a darling of Rome's religious circles, yet her friendship with Michelangelo raised eyebrows that never truly lowered. Their correspondence, filled with spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, walked the razor's edge between divine love and forbidden desire. The Church called it Platonic. Rome called it obvious. Others were far less subtle. The Orsini and Farnese women used beauty and influence to entangle cardinals, artists, and ambassadors alike. Their salons became theaters of flirtation, where poetry and philosophy were pretexts for seduction. Affairs were conducted with coded letters, saintly portraits that concealed love notes, and pilgrimages that conveniently led to a lover's villa outside the city walls. But discretion was survival. A nobleman's indiscretion could be excused as vigorous temperament. A woman's could be punished with exile or worse. That didn't stop them. Many noble women mastered the art of looking holy while living wickedly. They went to confession daily, ensuring their sins never piled up too high, and dressed modestly in public while hiding embroidered bodices beneath their cloaks. Behind every painted virgin on a palace wall was a story of guilt and hunger. And while the Vatican thundered about purity, Rome's noble women wrote sonnets about passion. They knew the game: sin quietly, repent beautifully, and never get caught. In a city where men wielded power in public, women learned to wield it in private. And often, their whispers in the dark echoed louder than any sermon from the pulpit. Art was Rome's most respectable disguise for desire. Beneath the halo of divine inspiration, painters and sculptors filled chapels with visions that were less about heaven and more about flesh. The Renaissance brought a revival of the human form, and artists embraced it with an enthusiasm that occasionally forgot where beauty ended and blasphemy began. Take Raphael, Rome's golden boy. His frescoes glowed with serenity, but behind the serenity lay a man famously incapable of resisting temptation. His muse, La Fornerina, a baker's daughter, inspired half his Madonnas. She became his obsession, his hidden partner, and depending on who you asked, the true model for the Virgin Mary herself. When Raphael died young, rumors spread it wasn't from fever, but from exhaustion after a night of overzealous artistic study. Michelangelo, in contrast, wrestled with guilt as much as marble. His figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling were technically biblical, but no one could miss how lovingly he sculpted every muscle and curve. Some church officials grumbled his saints looked a bit too human. His defenders called it divine anatomy. His critics, pornography. The man himself prayed, sculpted, and agonized, torn between devotion and the undeniable beauty of the body. Then came the true rebels, Caravaggio, chief among them. His art glowed with divine light, but dripped with human vice. His models were often prostitutes and thieves pulled straight from the streets, their raw sensuality painted onto the faces of saints and martyrs. To him, holiness and sin were inseparable twins. His Judith beheading Holofernes was painted with such violence and erotic tension that viewers couldn't decide whether to cross themselves or look away. For every sacred commission, there was an unholy inspiration. Artists were paid by the church to glorify God, but in doing so, they also glorified the human body. the very thing the church warned against. Their studios were confessionals with paint and skin instead of rosaries. In Renaissance Rome, art wasn't just decoration. It was temptation made visible. Each brushstroke was a gamble between salvation and scandal. And as frescoes bloomed, if you wanted to glimpse the true soul of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the pulsing, laughing, sinful heart, you went during the days when masks hid faces, wine replaced sermons, and the line between priest and peasant vanished under torchlight. During those times, even the church relaxed its grip. Cardinals attended masquerades to observe the youth, which usually meant chasing dancers until dawn. Monks wandered the streets, drunk on spiced wine, quoting scripture with the confidence of men who hadn't read it recently. The streets overflowed with symbolism and sin. Floats carried allegories of virtue defeating vice, though most spectators rooted for vice. Courtesans disguised themselves as nuns. Nuns disguised themselves as courtesans, and both seemed to enjoy the confusion. Confessionals filled up the next week, priests shaking their heads solemnly while taking careful notes. Those confessions became Rome's unofficial gossip network. A penitent might confess an affair with a married cardinal, only to find her sins recited back to her later by a smirking servant. Secrets had a short lifespan in the eternal city. One monk even joked that in Rome, the Holy Spirit didn't descend as a dove, it arrived as a rumor. The contradiction was spectacular. Sin was punished and celebrated. Parades passed beneath frescoes of the Last Judgment. The same hands that tossed roses into the crowd clasped rosaries the next morning. The faithful blamed human weakness, as though weakness were the city's favorite sport. When the festivities ended, Rome washed its face and put its halo back on. Priests thundered about virtue. Nobles returned to their marriages. The streets smelled again of incense instead of sweat and wine. But the memory lingered. Behind every saintly procession was a hangover. And beneath every Ave Maria whispered in penance lurked a quiet, knowing smile. Because everyone in Rome understood one thing: forgiveness came cheap. But the pleasures of sin were priceless. No discussion of Rome's moral collapse would be complete without the Borghese, the family that turned sin into statecraft. If ordinary Romans gossiped about lust and greed, the Borgias patented it. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, ruled not like a shepherd of souls, but like the godfather of an Italian crime syndicate. The syndicate also issued indulgences. His Vatican was a stage for decadence. Witnesses spoke of banquets where courtesans dined naked, of rooms draped in silk and perfumed with scandal. One particularly infamous night later, dubbed the Banquet of Chestnuts, featured 50 dancers, cardinals tossing roasted chestnuts onto the floor, and guests crawling to collect them in a display of shameless indulgence. Whether the story was exaggerated hardly mattered. Rome believed it on, that was enough. Rodrigo's children were the real proof of his dual legacy. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was charming, handsome, and entirely ruthless. He murdered rivals with the same efficiency his father used to grant pardons. His sister Lucretia became a legend, accused of incest, poisonings, and seductions, though much was likely propaganda. Still, her ability to manipulate the men around her husbands, lovers, even popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. The The Borgias blurred every line between holiness and hedonism. Their private vices spilled into public policy. Cardinals were appointed through bribery. Sins were forgiven for gold. Marriage alliances were sealed with sheets instead of signatures. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but never one who treated the papacy like a family business. Yet, in their defense, the Borgias were simply more open about what everyone else was doing in secret. While other families hid their excess behind Latin sermons, the Borgias wore theirs, proudly gilded and perfumed. They transformed the Vatican into both a brothel and a battlefield, depending on the day. When Alexander VI finally died ironically, after a banquetroom sighed in relief, but also in admiration. He had been a sinner, yes, but an unforgettable one. His reign left the church stained, his name cursed, but his legend, the Borgias, proved a timeless truth in the right hands. Sin could be the ultimate power. For all its outrage and sermons, the church wasn't merely a victim of sin, it was its enabler. The hierarchy thundered against lust from the pulpit, but behind marble walls, coin purses clinked louder than conscience. Every indulgence sold, every absolution granted, was part of a grand economy of forgiveness. You could sleep with your mistress, confess it the next morning, and walk out spiritually spotless so long as your donation was generous. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was business. Sin, after all, was reliable income. The Vatican's coffers swelled with money from those seeking redemption for pleasures they fully intended to repeat. In a sense, the Church had turned desire into a subscription service. Sin, confess, pay, repeat. Monks, who should have been illuminating Bibles, were instead tallying receipts. Cardinals owned vineyards, lent money, and maintained luxurious estates stocked with servants and lovers. One bishop famously had so many illegitimate children that locals nicknamed his palace the House of the Lord and his extended family. And yet these same men presided over inquisitions and moral trials, condemning peasants for sins that were practically Vatican traditions. When voices of reform rose, monks whispering that the Church had lost its soul, they were silenced or exiled. It was dangerous to accuse God's representatives of acting like merchants. Still, rumors of papal indulgence and debauchery spread faster than any decree. Even the faithful began to smirk when priests warned against temptation. They'd seen too many sermons end at the local tavern. The irony was divine. The more the Church preached against sin, the more it depended on it. Without lust, greed, and guilt, half of Rome's economy and the other half of the Vatican would collapse overnight. Some tried to reform the system from within. A few honest friars denounced the corruption, only to be ignored, reassigned, or mysteriously fall ill. Others simply accepted that the circus was beautiful from the stands. From the chariot, it was a slaughterhouse. Death came quick, loud, and merciless. A single snapped wheel, one startled horse, and it was over. The people even had a word for it: naphregema, shipwreck, because that's what a crash looked like. Wood splintering like waves, bodies flung into the air, screams swallowed by the crowd's roar. You saw your first one as a boy. The driver ahead misjudged the turn around the spina. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered, and sent his chariot spinning. The horses panicked, dragging him by the reins as his body bounced across the sand like a broken doll. You smelled the blood, The crowd erupted not in horror, but in ecstasy. Death was their favorite finish line. Every race was a gamble with fate. You learned to watch for the warnings, the flicker in a horse's gait, the wobble of a rival's wheel, the tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than thought, to steer by instinct when reason would freeze. The circus punished hesitation. A good charioteer died quick. A great one learned to make death his ally. The crashes were worst near the meta, the turning posts. Drivers fought for the inside lane where victory lived and disaster waited. You hugged the curve so tight you could feel the marble scrape your axle. Too wide and you'd lose the race. Too tight and you'd join the wreckage. There was no in-between, only glory or ruin. Sometimes, when a crash happened behind you, the screams faded beneath the thunder of hooves. You never looked back. To survive, you had to be ruthless. Compassion was for poets and priests, not for men who raced the gods. You told yourself each crash was another sacrifice to Neptune, god of horses, and whispered a prayer that it would never be your turn. But every driver knew the truth. Luck was a rope that always frayed. One day, you'd feel it snap. And when it did, the circus would keep roaring. The crowd would keep cheering. Rome would move on its appetite for blood, as endless as its thirst for speed. If death was always one turn away, fortune sat in the other. For those who lasted long enough, chariot racing was the swiftest road from chains to staggering wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same frenzy it used to crucify its losers. You began as property, but with every victory, you became something rarer, a man who owned his fate. Your winnings grew faster than the crowd could shout your name. Bags of silver, laurel crowns, fine cloaks, golden goblet spoils, once reserved for generals, were yours. You bought your freedom first, then your house, then horses of your own. Men who once spat at your feet now bowed when you entered the tavern. Senators nodded to you in the forum, pretending they didn't remember your slave brand. You smiled because you knew they did. Women followed too, some for love, most for legend. Courtesans, noble widows, even priestesses found reasons to pray with you. Fame turned everything you touched to excess. Banquets lasted until dawn, your name echoing in drunken toasts. You spent money like sand through your fingers because the gods had made you fast, but not immortal. And yet, the higher you climbed, the lonelier the air became. Friends became flatterers. Admirers became thieves. You learned that Rome didn't love you, it loved the myth of you, the man who cheated death, who tamed thunder, who could make the city forget its hunger for one glorious afternoon. Still, you couldn't stop. Fortune was a fever you couldn't shake. The circus was your temple, and each race another prayer to keep your luck alive. You invested in your. At feasts, poets recited your name beside Hercules and Achilles. You laughed, but deep down, the comparison chilled you. Heroes never lived long in Rome. They burned bright, then vanished. And you knew that one day, whether by age, accident, or envy, the circus would take back everything it had given. Fortune was generous, but she always collected her debts. Time caught every charioteer, no matter how swift his team. Your hands, once strong enough to tame stallions, began to tremble when you held the reins. The cheers that once lifted your soul now felt distant as if muffled behind the roar of memory. You told yourself you'd retire after one more race, but the circus had a way of whispering, "Just one more." The younger drivers were faster now, reckless boys who raced as you once had, with no thought of survival. They called you veteranus, half in respect, half in pity. You watched them train and saw your own ghost in their eyes, hungry, fearless, doomed. The track hadn't changed, but you had. The same sand that once promised immortality now waited to swallow you. Still, the itch returned every dawn. You couldn't ignore the sound of wheels rattling, the thunder of hooves, the intoxicating pull of danger. So you strapped the reins around your waist one last time and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd erupted, not out of routine, but out of recognition. You were legend now, a living relic of the golden years. The gates opened, the horses lunged forward, and for a heartbeat you felt 20 again. The wind tore at your tunic. Sand stung your face. Your pulse matched the pounding of hooves. You hugged the meta tighter than you should have, pride overriding sense. Behind you, a rival's wheel clipped your axle. You felt the jolt, the violent shudder, the whisper of fate. Then silence for a heartbeat. Everything slowed. The sunlight on the marble statues, the hiss of the crowd's breath, that moment before the crash. You didn't pray. You just smiled. You had always known the circus would take you this way. When the wreck came, the crowd roared not in grief, but in awe. They said the horses ran 3 more laps before stopping, that the sand turned crimson beneath them. They carried your broken body from the track, draped in the blue colors of your faction, and buried you beneath a small monument outside the city walls. The inscription read, "He rode with the gods. He fell like a storm." And somewhere beyond the roar of the circus, you still race forever, chasing the thunder. Long before stone pierced the sky, or temples echoed with hymns to the sun god, the true lifeline of Egypt was already at work. The Nile, it wasn't just a river. It was an engineer of worlds carving life from desolation. From the heart of the south it rose, swelling with rains from distant lands, spilling its gift across parched valleys. When the waters came, they brought siltrich, dark and miraculous. Without it, the land would have been nothing but dust and wind to the people of this soil. The flood wasn't a natural event. It was divine rhythm. They didn't just watch the river, they listened to it. The rise of the water, its retreat, the beginning of harvest. Every life, from the humblest farmer to the highest ruler, depended on that pulse. The entire rhythm of existence revolved around it. 3 sacred seasons, Akit, the flooding, Pere, the growing, and Shimu, the harvest. The Nile was time itself, living clock that set the pace of eternity. But the river was never tamed. Some seasons it rose too high, drowning fields and villages. Others, it barely stirred, leaving famine in its wake. So the people did what humans always do when faced with nature's will. They learned to shape it. They measured its depths with markings carved into temple stone, recorded its moods, and built a science around its behavior. Over generations, they turned a wild current into a precision instrument. When the floodwaters began to recede, they moved quickly, digging canals, building reservoirs, trapping what remained. Each family took its part in this sacred ritual, turning mud and water into order. What began as survival evolved into mastery. They didn't just live by the Nile, they engineered it. In the shimmer of its waters, civilization found its reflection. The river connected gods to mortals, priests to peasants, life to death. Its banks became the stage where humanity learned that control over nature wasn't about domination, it was about harmony. The Nile didn't belong to the land. The land belonged to the Niland. It would keep shaping destiny for ages beyond counting. When the river swelled, the people held their breath. The flood was both miracle and Manasseh blessing that could easily turn to ruin. For generations, survival meant reading the river's moods. And so, they became mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers before those words had names. They measured the world not by stars or conquests, but by water. The priests of Heliopolis watched the eastern sky for the risings of Sirius Optitu's first gleam at dawn heralded the flood's approach. Its appearance wasn't superstition. It was a signal from the heavens that life was being renewed. Villages cheered at its sight because it meant the waters were coming. But prediction was only half the battle. Control was the true test. Along the banks, workers dug canals, stretching for miles, guiding the flood into basins and channels. With wooden shovels and stone picks, they carved the land's first arteries of irrigation. Engineers divided the earth into fields bordered by low earthen walls that held the water, letting it soak slowly into the soil. When the river withdrew, it left behind perfect moisture for barley, flax, and wheat. This wasn't chaos. It was geometry. Fields were measured with precision, each plot mapped and assessed by its fertility. Surveyors called rope stretchers walked the land after every flood to redraw boundaries washed away by the current. Their ropes weren't just tools. They were the birth of mathematics itself. Yet nature never fully obeyed. When the river stayed silent, drought devoured everything. When it surged too fiercely, entire villages vanished. To temper its power, they built dikes and embankments, sometimes small dams of stone and mud. These works demanded not just strength, but unity, a society that could move thousands with a single purpose. The Nile wasn't merely a source of food. It was a proving ground for organization, labor, and vision. It demanded constant vigilance and rewarded discipline. Through water, the people learned the art of cooperation. And as the river yielded, it taught them something timeless, that civilization is not built by conquest, but by rhythm, by mastering the flood without defying it to them. Time itself flowed from the Nile. The river's pulse shaped the calendar, the rituals, even the soul of an entire people, while others marked years by wars or kings. They measured existence by the rise and fall of the water. Every cycle was a story of death, rebirth, and harvest played out, not in palaces, but in the river's current. Their year turned in three great acts: Akhet, when floods swallowed the fields; Pere, when crops rose from black silt; and Shemu, when the earth gave back what the river had promised. Each season unfolded in rhythm. Each month held its days, balanced by festival nights, to honor the gods and steady the cosmic order. The pattern was mathematical, but its meaning was sacred. When Sirius first gleamed in the eastern sky before dawn, it signaled the start of Akhet. Priests along the river watched for it with reverence. They believed this light was the goddess of the flood herself. Her radiance, awakening the sleeping Nile. It was their first celestial prophecy, a cosmic calendar uniting heaven, earth, and water. Every village welcomed the flood with song and offering. Farmers praised Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, giving bread and beer to ensure the waters rose just enough, not so little as to starve them, not so much as to drown their homes. The flood's arrival wasn't merely awaited, it was celebrated like the return of a god. This rhythm gave them something rare: predictability. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to store grain. The Nile turned chaos into order, nature into schedule, survival into tradition. Time, once wild and unknowable, now flowed with the certainty of a current shaped by human hands. Beyond their borders, seasons meant fear. But here, people faced the future with calm. They didn't resist the river's rhythm. They lived within it. In its steady heartbeat, they found eternity, not measured in years, but in floods. They didn't just wait for the Nile, they shaped it. Every canal, every basin, every reservoir was a thread in a grand tapestry of an engineered landscape. The earliest rulers understood: whoever held the water held the land. Power flowed through ditches and dikes as surely as through crowns. The first builders of channels were visionaries with shovels, using only simple tools: woven plows, woven baskets, copper blades. They redirected the river's path, carving veins through the desert. These canals turned the flood's randomness into reliable harvests, carrying water to fields far from the main current. The land grew less subject to the river's whims and more attuned to its rhythm. Irrigation became a shared undertaking, thousands laboring under the watch of engineers and scribes. Each basin measured, each channel recorded. Canals weren't just ditches, they were the skeleton of a civilization that learned to breathe with the river. In the end, the Nile demanded balance, not control but partnership. And in that balance, a people found not just survival, but splendor. They built monuments not to defy time, but to echo the river's eternal returnstone, mirrors of a current that gave life, took it, and gave it again. For in the land of Egypt, the greatest truth was written not in temples, but in water. All things flow. Canals were never just practical, they were political. When a ruler ordered a new network of waterways, it was not only to nourish the land, it was to prove divine authority. The god-king did not merely pray for floods, he commanded them. One of the earliest great works was known as the Be'er Yusufta, Canal of Joseph. Whether born of myth or memory, it carried water from the great river to the Fayum Depression, turning a barren basin into the land's oldest reclaimed farmland. Even remote desert towns were bound by its flow. Irrigation reshaped their economies and their loyalties. A canal that ran dry could ruin a province. A well-placed diversion could birth a settlement. Water became currency, and the ruler, its banker. Scribes documented every drop, carving tallies onto papyrus and temple walls. But canals also united the land. They became highways for trade, carrying goods, ideas, and people between distant regions. The same water that fed wheat in the south carried granite for monuments in the north. The river's veins stitched the nation together. Each channel was a statement of intent, humanity cooperating with nature, not conquering it. Greatness did not rise from gold or conquest. It flowed quietly in irrigation trenches where sweat and engineering transformed survival into civilization. Behind every harvest, every floodgate, every monument stood a quiet army, the engineers, surveyors, and scribes who turned water into order. They were not poets or warriors, yet the land owed them everything. Without them, the river's blessings would have drowned or starved the people. With them, it became the most fertile valley on earth. The shadoofa, simple counterweighted lever, was one of their earliest triumphs. With it, a single farmer could lift buckets from canal to field, feeding crops by hand when the floodwaters had withdrawn. Later came the sakia, a water wheel turned by oxen, multiplying that effort. What began as toil evolved into mechanical rhythm. The land's first machines were born not from luxury, but necessity. But the true visionaries were the surveyors, the rope stretchers. After every flood, when boundaries vanished beneath silt, they paced the fields with knotted cords, measuring anew. Their work was not guesswork. It was geometry. Angles, distances, and proportions became tools of empire. The knowledge they gathered shaped not only fields but the foundations of temples and tombs. From water levels came symmetry on, from symmetry, civilization. Then came the scribes, the keepers of the river's memory. They tracked water heights with nilometer stone pillars marked with carved cubits, stationed at sacred sites. These gauges transformed a natural event into data. When the water rose too high, they warned of inundation. When it fell too low, they prepared for scarcity. Priests read the numbers as divine messages, but the engineers knew better. They were simply reading the river's pulse. Even the ruler relied on these calculations. A misjudged flood meant not just hunger, but unrest. In truth, the engineers were guardians of stability. Their success was invisible, their failure catastrophic. They wore no crowns, yet they held the kingdom together. Every brick of every monument, every loaf in a laborer's hands began with their measurements. They bridged the gap between gods and mortals, between chaos and control. Their mathematics flowed downstream into the very structure of the land itself. In a world ruled by divine order, they were the quiet priests of precision, the architects, not of temples, but of life. To the people of this soil, the river was not water. It was a living God. Its floods were divine moods, its currents sacred speech. They called it Hapi, the bringer of abundance, lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose body ran through the veins of the land. Every drop was his blessing, every dry season his silence. When the flood came, priests led ceremonies at the banks. Offerings of bread, beer, and flowers floated downstream, meant to please Hapi and coax generosity. In the temples of Thebes and Memphis, hymns were sung not to conquerors or kings, but to the river that sustained them all. You flood the fields. You give life to all that lives. You are the God of bread. The flood was not chaos. It was divine order in motion, a proof that Mat, the cosmic balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or too low, it was a warning that harmony had been broken. The ruler, as the earthly embodiment of Mat, bore the sacred duty of restoring that balance. When the river failed, so too did his right to rule. The river was not just water, it was politics, theology, and prophecy woven into one. Yet the people did not fear the river as others feared their gods. They revered it with familiarity, almost tenderness. They painted Hapi as neither male nor female, but both fertile, round-bellied, generous. He symbolized abundance without violence, creation without conquest. Even death was tied to his gift. When the flood receded, the rich black silted left behind was called Kemetha, Black Land. From this word came the land's ancient name. Festivals greeted the inundation like the dawn of creation. Children danced in the streets. Farmers sang as they repaired their dikes. Priests announced the rising waters with drums and incense. For a few precious weeks, the land was united not by ruler or war, but by water. The river's rhythm was not merely agricultural. It was spiritual architecture. Each rise and fall was a heartbeat in the body of a god. And through that god, the people found immortality. Empires might rise and fall, but as long as Hapi returned, life and faith would begin again. As the floodwaters spread, they carried a silent gift, fine black silt. To the people, this was not mud. It was the river's voice, the language of creation itself. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a glistening layer, rich with minerals from distant mountains. This black soil Kemet was the difference between feast and famine, between civilization and dust. Farmers knew its texture by touch alone. A handful of Nile silt, smooth, dark, cool, was worth more than gold. It grew wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, everything that fed body and empire. Each family held its plot, bordered by earthen ridges that trapped the water. Once the flood receded, oxen plowed the damp fields, and seeds were cast into the gleaming mud. Within weeks, the land erupted into green, a miracle so regular it felt divine. Scribes recorded each harvest, comparing yield to flood height. From these notes, patterns emerged. Low floods meant scarcity and rising grain prices. Generous floods meant surplus and calm. Over generations, this quiet observation became science. Farmers did not just plant, they learned to listen to the silt, to read its weight, color, and spread. The soil even shaped the cities. Villages rose on higher ground to escape the flood, while fields stretched in long ribbons along the banks. The narrow green valley, cradled by desert, created a civilization perfectly poised between chaos and order. Each flood erased and redrew the landscape, forcing the people to adapt, to rebuild, to remember. In a way, the river wrote history. Temples and tombs were built of stone, but the foundation of the land's story was mud, wet, black, eternal. Even the pigment in their frescoes came from the same silt that nourished their crops. The river was not just feeding the land, was painting it. When outsiders saw the river's bounty, they called it magic. But to those who lived by its banks, there was nothing supernatural about it. It was partnership, not miracle. The Nile gave and they listened. The silt was the handwriting of the gods, and they learned to read it fluently, season after season. Controlling the river's gift required more than reverence. It demanded precision. The people turned worship into engineering, transforming the natural flood into a system of managed abundance. What began as simple channels grew into a living network of hydraulic intelligence, stretching from the delta to the southern hills, a grand circuit where every basin, dike, and canal played its part. At the heart were the basin fields, vast rectangles bordered by earthen walls. When the flood arose, Channels filled these basins in careful sequence. Water lingered for weeks, soaking the soil before being drained onward. The process echoed the river's own rhythm, but under human guidance. The result was controlled fertility, a man-made echo of the divine pulse. Lifting water was the next challenge. The shadufa, counterbalanced lever, with a bucket and a weight revolutionized irrigation. A single farmer could raise hundreds of liters a day from canals to higher fields. Later came the sakia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, its pots scooping and pouring in endless rhythm. These devices were simple but brilliant, powered by muscle and geometry. Not magic, every flood demanded coordination on a national scale. Laborers repaired dikes and dredged canals under orders that flowed from local governors to royal engineers. The ruler's decrees moved like the water itself, ensuring every village contributed to the balance. A breach in one region could doom another far downstream. Even temples were part of the system. Priests used nilometers, vertical shafts, marked in sacred measures, to read the water's height. From these readings, they could foresee harvests, taxes, and the land's stability for the coming cycle. Science, faith, and governance converged at the waterline. The river's true machinery was not made of stone or bronze. It was made of people, tens of thousands, moving in synchrony, guided by the river's tempo. The land's greatest wonder was not a pyramid or a sphinx. It was this invisible infrastructura civilization built not to fight nature, but to think like it. The flood was Nand, so was their genius in mastering it, long after the names of rulers faded and their temples